morning, everybody. What a delight to have you here and to, well, be here for that matter, and to follow my friend Karen Sigeman. And I just want to start by saying this would not have happened without Karen Sigeman's tireless efforts. The fact that she is almost out of voice is just one indicator of what she's doing to try to make sure that all of this comes together in now state after state after state after state to try to, as she just said, bring the truth of where we find ourselves to people like yourselves who we believe will make all the difference in the trajectory of this country in the course of this election season and beyond. And I just want to emphasize a point that she touched on. We're approaching this not from a partisan point of view. We think the facts speak for themselves. We are confident that common sense-minded Americans will arrive at the right conclusions when provided with the facts. And so while some may decide to say a bit more of their own personal views on this subject in the course of the program, what we're trying to do here is nonpartisan and is very much with the mind to informing and empowering rather than telling you what to do. Having said all that, I'm going to tell you about some things that you can do that are vitally needed. But I'm going to pick up first with kind of what Karen did a little bit, which is give you some overview, some sort of introduction to what is in store in the course of this extraordinary program. And let me just say, the people that Karen has pulled together to be here are among the folks that I'm most thrilled to be able to say are both friends as well as extraordinary colleagues. Truly the best of the best in this national security arena at this particularly perilous time for the national security. So we have, I think, made available to you and to the people who will be watching these videos in the days, weeks, months, hopefully to come, a faculty, if you will, to equip you with not only those facts that I mentioned a moment ago, but with insights that are generally not widely understood. And that's part of what makes these programs, this roadshow, as we call it, so desperately needed, is you're going to hear information that is available if you look for it. It is, I think, beyond disputing, but it is generally not what is served up by, unfortunately, not just the media, not just academia, not just Hollywood, God knows, but not, by and large, by our political elites either, with some exceptions. Making all the more vital, I think, this conversation with you, and we hope it will be a conversation. There's time afforded to interact both on the stage and when we're in breaks, and we look forward to that. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about World War III. I personally have come to call it World War Z, because I believe, and this is kind of my unified field theory, if you will, of where we are at the moment, that virtually every threat this country faces today is being directly or indirectly facilitated, enabled, if not directly, a product of Emperor Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party's General Secretary, President of the People's Republic of China, and the greatest megalomaniac in the history of the world. And I would be happy to take challenges to that idea. But when you look at what we're here to talk with you about today, and I'll give you just sort of a flavor of it, when you look at unrestricted warfare in particular, which is not entirely of his, mind, but it is certainly something that he has been pursuing relentlessly and enabling others to join in pursuing in a way that has made it an unprecedented threat. Yes, to freedom, as Karen said, but most especially to our nation and its people. So let me give you a little bit of a flavor of that, and how it is that whatever the exact provenance of these various problems, and again, some of them I think are more directly linked to the CCP, as we call it for short, the Chinese Communist Party, some less directly, but all of them benefit Communist China. All of them, all of what's being done to America, to our people, to our culture, to our freedoms, benefits the ambitions of Xi Jinping and his party. So just to give you a few examples, and I've come to describe what I think the direct part of this entails, and that is a kind of strategic arson by Xi. It is, as communists are fond of saying, no accident, comrade, that the myriad conflagrations that are underway or in the works around the world at the moment have been preceded by pretty much the direct involvement of the perpetrators with Xi Jinping himself. Think about Ukraine. Shortly before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, he went to Beijing nominally to participate in the opening ceremonies of the, well, we called them the Genocide Games in the Olympics there. He met with Xi. They announced with considerable fanfare a no-limits partnership that was going to remake the world. And it's pretty clear that what Xi communicated to Putin was he was fine with Putin invading Ukraine. In fact, I think welcomed it, if not ordered it. But only after the Olympics were over. Didn't want any messiness involving his grand production. And sure enough, a week or two after the games are over, Vladimir Putin goes into Ukraine. And what we've seen ever since, as you know, in addition to the destruction of much of Ukraine at Russian hands, is the help that Putin has gotten in doing that. Notably, not exclusively, but notably from Xi Jinping in China. Also, by the way, some of the other partners, if you will, in very much, as is true of Russia really now, lesser status to the managing partner, if you will, China. Nations like Iran and North Korea, who are actively helping rearm the Russians so that they can engage in this war. And a similar conflagration was subsequently started after Iranian representatives and representatives of the Palestinian Authority made the pilgrimage to Beijing to be told, I am quite certain, that they should go into Israel. And in fact, there is evidence that the Chinese have been helping prepare Hamas for its war against Israel with armaments, yes, but also helping build out, as my friend Peter McElvena, from whom you'll be hearing shortly, notes, is an underground complex larger than the underground tube, as they call it, in London. Tunnels upon tunnels upon, tunnels. And it has made it exceedingly difficult for Israel to take down Hamas, that those tunnels have existed, and of course that they have been, I think rightly, used, believed to be housing hostages, including American hostages, making what you would otherwise do to destroy those tunnels or close them off, kill everybody in them, impossible. But it's not just Ukraine, and it's not just the Middle East, which of course, as you all know, is now turned into a regional conflict. Hamas, yes, in Gaza, but Hezbollah in the north of Israel. The Houthis operating in Yemen, closing the Red Sea. Iraqi militias, Syrian, Iranian operations, and of course the Iranians themselves doing attacks on Israel. Something that I am sorry to say I forecasted as I saw what the Biden administration was doing over the years to weaken Israel and to prop up the Iranian regime. But it has taken place with a vengeance to the point where today Israel is being assaulted on at least 7 different fronts, something we have not seen since, some of the earlier wars for its very survival. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I believe, was commissioned by Xi Jinping. Now, why is that so relevant? It's relevant because in these 2 instances in particular, and some more that I'll mention here in a moment that are works in progress, China benefits directly from what we are doing in response to these conflagrations. We have sent most of our war materiel, certainly our emergency war material, to one or the other of these conflicts. Our military is stretched very thin, and our ability to provide further military assistance to places like Taiwan is extremely limited, to the point where, I don't know if you caught this, there was a report, I think yesterday, that some of the kit that we had sent to the Taiwanese, in particular things like armored vests and artillery shells and bullets and the like, were water damaged and covered with mold and otherwise made unusable. Do you think that message was lost on the Taiwanese? And we'll get to some of the other policies that the Biden administration has been pursuing that have compounded that sense on the part of our allies that we're not such a great ally at the moment. But just in terms of coming attractions, the Philippines are currently being subjected to increasing acts of intimidation and aggression by the Chinese themselves. The North Koreans are acting up. Clearly, I think, again, having been encouraged to do so after visits in Beijing by Kim Jong-un. We have Maduro, the man who was recently defeated in Venezuela's election and who nonetheless is going to continue on, having come from his particular mission to Beijing, announcing that he was going to invade Guyana. He hasn't done it just yet, but it can happen at any time. And the Chinese are, I think, again, going to help with that, as may the Russians and perhaps the Iranians as well. All of whom, by the way, if you haven't noticed this, are very active in Latin America at the moment, which is kind of a problem for us. Some call it our backyard, and we generally have treated it with studied indifference, but it happens to be extremely important strategically to us. Look no further than our southern border, just for starters, to say nothing of what happens if you have another Cuban Missile Crisis. Maybe in Cuba, maybe in Venezuela, maybe in Brazil, maybe in Nicaragua, maybe in Mexico. All places where, among others, the Chinese are very active at the moment. So just to sort of give you a flavor of this, because many of our colleagues are going to talk about, I think, aspects of this in more detail. So I just want to give it sort of an overview. But I would say that when you look at all of this in its whole, rather than just sort of the individual pieces, it's pretty extraordinary that we find ourselves in a world that is on fire, I think as a result of Xi's strategic arson. I touched on our borders. This is clearly a problem that you all have been seized with, I'm sure. We're hearing a lot about a community not too different from this one in Ohio. A lot of talk about who's eating what there at the moment. But the point is that what's happening there, what's happening here, what's happening in cities across this country that are all now border communities, is the growing chaos that accompanies the unchecked infusion of clearly more than 10 million illegal aliens whose origins, let alone whose personal backgrounds, to say nothing of intentions, we have no idea about. Of particular concern to me, and relevant to this conversation, of course, is that by some estimates, among those 10 million plus, are some undetermined, certainly thousands, of unaccompanied, military-aged Chinese national males, many of whom, by the account of people knowledgeable about these things, on the border, Michael Yon is one of them, Todd Bensman is another. These are people who are People's Liberation Army personnel, probably special forces. Some of this is a technical term used in the intelligence community, clues are that they have the tattoos of Chinese special forces. They have high and tight haircuts. They're wearing more or less the same camouflage outfits and carrying similar backpacks and moving in units. This gives Xi Jinping, to say the obvious, an option to engage in a conflagration inside America at will. And maybe it will be for the purposes of just general mayhem. Maybe it will be for the purposes of influencing an election. Maybe it'll be for the purposes of assuring that we will not interfere with whatever else he decides he's going to do elsewhere in the world, whether it's vis-a-vis the Philippines perhaps, or maybe Taiwan. All of which is to say, these are not happening in isolation, folks. These are the sorts of things that reflect, I believe, a calculated strategy for World War Xi. Let me just give you a couple of other examples of things that are worth noting. We have become, as you know, dependent on China for most things. I mean, it's hard to find a supply chain that doesn't predominantly rely upon something from China. Maybe it's raw materials, rare earth minerals, they call them, or maybe it's finished products. And not only that, but we have a government here, the United States administration. I can't keep straight whether we're calling it now the Biden-Harris administration or the Harris-Biden administration or the Obama 3.0 administration or whatever you call it, the US government is actually compounding that problem by what has been done in the name of green energy to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, of which we have an abundance, and rely more and more and more heavily on Chinese-made technologies for batteries, for electric vehicles, for windmills, for solar panels, and the like. But that's hardly the only dependency. What about medical supplies? Virtually every pharmaceutical prescription drug is either produced in China or relies on chemicals that go into it, maybe fabricated in India, but they're nonetheless coming from China as well. We have a particular concern about that, I think, because, as you may have noticed, we were recently subjected to a biological warfare attack against us. And there's more where that came from, folks. In fact, there's more and worse than what was unleashed upon us in the form of COVID-19. And how bad could it be if simultaneously with such an attack being mounted again, the medical, products that might attenuate it just don't happen to be available. We got a taste of that with those, masks and gowns and gloves and things, which they wound up not only, restricting in terms of their export from China, but they went and bought them up all over the rest of the world, knowing what they had unleashed, by the way. Belt and Road Initiative is something else I just want to touch on here quickly. That's a term that's a classic Chinese deflection. This has nothing to do with belts and roads and so. This is about building a colonial empire worldwide. We did a study, I think Karen didn't mention this, my day job is with the Center for Security Policy, and we produced a report out of the center and the Committee on the Present Danger of China too, on this Belt and Road Initiative about 2 years ago, I think now, and then I was astonished to discover that about 147 countries out of about 190 that exist in the world are already hooked up to this Belt and Road Initiative, that are part of that colonial enterprise, that are mostly taking financing from China to build ports, to build airfields, to build road networks, to build railways, to get access to the raw materials that the Chinese Communist Party seeks in these various places. One curious thing about all of those infrastructure investments, by the way, is that they're basically designed for dual use. Yes, for the various commercial applications that are obvious, but also for the purposes of their use by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. In other words, for power projection, if not immediately, in due course. And if not under the present circumstances, certainly after the Chinese foreclose on what are basically payday loans that are used to finance these things, when, predictably, the underdeveloped nations in which they're building them can't pay, their premiums. So this is the sort of thing that reflects a long-term plan and a strategy to put themselves in positions around the world where they will be able to be genuinely prosecuting a world war against us, for which we are very ill-equipped. So, last quick point, and we'll get much more on this from several of our colleagues. You have, in addition to all of the foregoing, and in addition, by the way, to the People's Liberation Army personnel that are here, a very substantial enemies within problem. You have truly one of the world's leading experts on the subject here in Trevor Loudon. You'll be hearing from him, and he's got some wonderful books that I hope you will take aboard as well. This is a problem of both the Chinese nationals who are here, some 300,000 students, for example, and God only knows how many businessmen, buying farmland in places like Wisconsin, I think, certainly Michigan, elsewhere. But then you also have the phenomenon of elite capture. And I'm so sorry to say, as is often the case, I've come with exactly one of these books. But this is a book that came out of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series, of which our chairman, Brian Kennedy, and Trevor, and Jeff, and others in the room, Steve Coughlin, have participated over the years. They're a wonderful resource. We tried to capture the first 70. We're up to about 185, I think, now. In this book, it talks about the problem of not just China, but its friends. And again, you'll hear much more about this, but elite capture is a thing. And the implications of it are hard to overstate. So I'm almost out of time. I wanted to make two quick points. What do we do about this? Well, the first thing is what we're doing here. You need to understand this threat. Secondly, we need as a nation to disengage from China. We have for too long been feeding this enemy, literally as well as figuratively. There's talk now about tariffs. I think that's a good thing. Diversifying supply chains obviously has to be done. There was a very important thing that was done in the Cold War. It was easier to do then than it is now, but it needs to be revisited. There is an urgent need to try to restrict the flow of advanced technology that is particularly the militarily relevant kind to the Chinese, and that has to be something that we work on with our allies. A tough thing to do, especially since we essentially ripped up by the roots the mechanism that we had put in place for doing that back in the Cold War. You know, when that was over, didn't need that anymore. Well, it'd be right handy about now. But here's a key piece. I don't know how many of you have seen any of the reporting that Maria Bartiromo has been doing on this unbelievably insane practice, which she has called underwriting the enemy. And even more importantly, you may or may not believe that you probably are yourself investing in that enemy. If you have a pension fund or a 401k plan, or your money is in a mutual fund that has emerging markets in it, or an exchange-traded fund or an index fund, most investment vehicles these days, thanks to Wall Street's determined efforts to fund the Chinese Communist Party with your money, has now translated into at least some of it being in Chinese companies, including not a few who are directly involved in building up the Chinese military, which is another piece of this unrestricted warfare that has been moving ahead apace, and is giving rise to something that we'll, again, I'm sure be talking about more in the course of the day, that the option is no longer just unrestricted warfare of the pre-kinetic kind, as Karen mentioned, or even of the People's War that the Chinese Communist Party officially declared on us 5 years ago. We're talking about another option, as I mentioned, the PLA here and so on, shooting war. So it becomes absolutely imperative that we stop financing the people that would perpetrate that against us. The good news is that there is now a relatively easy option for you. If you have money, and I encourage you to talk to the people managing it for you, in an emerging market fund, you can now ask that it be moved into what they call an ex-China emerging market fund. It can be done with the click of a mouse. And by the way, right now, folks, you will get a better return on your investment in those ex-China funds than in the China ones. I'm going to close, and I've got about a minute and a half left, I think, less than a minute. There's one other piece of this unrestricted warfare that you need to be aware of, and we can talk more about it in the course of the day in Q&A or whatever. And that is the Chinese have been using aggressively another line of attack against us to bring about a new world order, and that is through their domination of international organizations. In June, they got the Director General of the World Health Organization emergency powers to both declare emergencies and tell us what we need to do about them. That involves a whole host of really problematic capabilities as well. Just this week, I'm happy to say the House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis said that agreement, that treaty, has to be sent to the Senate for its advice and consent, which hopefully we believe withheld. But here's the kicker, folks. They're going to try to do the same thing on the 22nd and 23rd of September for the Secretary General of the United Nations, to give him emergency powers, to declare whatever he thinks, conflicts, cyber attacks, other complex global shocks, asteroids, and just as a catch-all, anything he considers to be a black swan event is an emergency, and he will be able to tell us what we have to do about it. This is not only an affront to our form of government, this is an assault on it. We need your help making sure that that accord, which is expected to be approved by this UN Summit of the Future, as they're calling it, is also subjected to the advice and consent of the Senate. And then we need to help people like your own senator here in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, the best guy in the body as far as I'm concerned, make sure that those treaties are defeated and our form of government is preserved. Finally, I encourage you to think of this properly as a spiritual war. And one other thing that I encourage you all to do is to pray. Because without God's grace, this will not end well. With it, all things are possible. God bless you all.